this time we invited one of my favorite guests of all times, which is Ashley Armstrong. We're both passionate about thyroid. And we just happen to have on Dr. Alan Christianson, who is, in my view, the premier expert in the world on this topic. But this one's going to be great. You're going to love it.
The iodine content, which impacts thyroid health, has significantly increased in our food production system over the last 20 to 30 years.
The thyroid gland, it's processing this highly volatile molecule iodine, and it's a big source of free radicals. That's why it's an effective antiseptic. So in processing it, the thyroid is hugely dependent upon antioxidants like glutathione and superoxide dismutase. And the thyroid both generates antioxidants and has a lot of mechanisms to take up antioxidants made by the liver cells. So it's flooded with those, and it needs that. But when it's at a level of iodine that it can't tolerate, those mechanisms get overwhelmed, and there's then cellular damage.
There's people all over the internet saying you're deficient in iodine. Your thyroid problem is due to low iodine intake. And I think it's important for people to understand that could actually be causing them a lot of harm with their iodine supplementation. Iodine accumulation is a really big problem that our nation is facing. It's one of those government interventions. Oops.
Welcome, everyone. Dr. Mercola helping you take control of your health. And we've got part 2. And this time we invited one of my favorite guests of all times, which is Ashley Armstrong, my partner in crime, to revamp the entire agricultural system for the benefit of everyone here watching this. But we're here because we're both passionate about thyroid. And we just happen to have on Dr. Alan Christianson, who is, in my view, the premier expert in the world on this topic. And he's personally helped me out. And I'm confident. When I shared this with Ashley, she says, I got to be on the call next time. I said, great, this is going to be fun. So I've done a podcast with 2 guests before, but they're infrequent. But this one's going to be great. You're going to love it. And if you don't know who Ashley is, she, of course, is, she has her own podcast, and is the founder of Angel Acres, and pivoted from her engineering degree to be a regenerative farmer and help create a system to produce some of the healthiest food on the planet in the most ideal way. And she works with a lot of the Amish farmers. She's networked all across the country with them, and she's scaling up. And many of you now are getting her products, and we're just so happy that she's committed her work to do this, and happy that she's here because she's a big fan of Ray Peat and has a really solid understanding of thyroid, which we've never discussed other than superficially, but now we're going to go deep. So welcome, and thank you for joining us, both of you.
Thanks for having us on.
Yeah, happy to be here.
All right.
And I'm excited because the food production kind of really connects here. I've got quite a few questions at the end, but the iodine content, which impacts thyroid health, has significantly increased in our food production system over the last 20 to 30 years. So
Spot on.
Excited to dive into that as well.
Yeah, that'll be fun.
Yeah, yeah, and I think my observation or takeaway from our last interview, Ellen, was that this was modern healthcare systems, public health attempt to correct nutritional deficiencies. And what they've done, they've ruined this and threw three metals: fluoride, iron, and iodine. None of those should be in the food supply and added as a supplement. We don't need them as fortified foods, and that's caused so many problems. So maybe we can start there, because that seems to be from digesting information and really meditating and applying it personally since our last conversation. It's become obvious to me that the nexus, the origin of this epidemic, massive epidemic, is fortification of the food, is specifically with iodine. So can you comment on that?
Sure. So historically, in the recent past, in the 20s, 1910s, they were trying to recruit young men for the Great War, World War I. And about a third in areas near Michigan, near the Great Lakes, had enlarged thyroids. They weren't eligible. So one of the attempts was to add iodine to foods. 1924, that started. Before then, autoimmune thyroid disease was a rarity in medicine. Most doctors, Joe, in med school, there's all these things we reread about in pathophysiology, and a lot of them we never saw. They were so obscure. And that's what autoimmune thyroid disease was for doctors then. But in the following decade, the rates of it among adult women went up 26-fold. not percent, fold. The rates of it skyrocketed. And there was tons of scathing reports and journal entries written, hey, this is a problem. We've just created a big issue here.
Yeah. So I'm wondering, what is the normal course of someone who's severely hypothyroid? Hyperthyroidism could kill you, but Graves' disease. But hypothyroidism, I think it's rare. Whatever. I mean, you can get mixed edema and go into coma, but for the most part, you have so many serious symptoms that you're always going to seek medical attention. It's never a medical emergency.
Well, totally agreed. And for even further along, the autoimmunity is a separate variable from the hypothyroidism.
Yes.
Many people never have frank hypothyroidism, but they're still suffering from the autoimmunity.
No, I'm referring to the hypothyroidism they were seeking to treat by the goiters that you referenced.
They weren't hypothyroid. They weren't hypothyroid.
Oh, they weren't. They just had goiters.
Yeah.
I didn't know that. Yeah. I assumed they were hypothyroid.
Nope, just structurally abnormal.
Is there any?
They just didn't fit the military criteria, was what it was.
Oh, that is new. Did you know that, Ashley?
No, and it's so interesting because livestock always follow suit. So, they added iodine to the salt then, you're saying, around the early 1900s?
1924. There was never a mandatory federal
100
step,
years.
But 1924, it started being done on a voluntary basis around the Great Lakes.
So then they did that for human salt, and then they started increasing. They were like, oh, well, if humans are deficient in iodine, then animals must be deficient in iodine. And so if you look at any mineral pack, any common conventional mineral packs, they're loaded with iodine.
Well, so fun thing to add to that point, totally agree. The UK didn't fortify their salt with iodine in 24, but a decade after us, they started fortifying animal feed with iodine. And they saw the same problem about a decade delayed in humans.
Because the same thing. So Dr. Mercola sent me the link to your guys' last interview. And I think one of the big summary points there was that iodine accumulation is a really big problem that our nation is facing. And like you said, Dr. Mercola, it's one of those government interventions. Oops. Oops.
We're the benefactor of those oops.
It's unfortunate because you've got one side of the coin that says we're still deficient in iodine. And I know of people max supplementing with the iodine that they put on their skin.
Yeah.
And then on the other side, we've got Dr. Christianson, who has a ton of experience treating people with thyroid problems and showing, no, it's actually an iodine overdose. Like all of us are loaded in iodine. Overloaded. And so I can understand people's frustrations, right? Like as a social media user, as someone who's just trying to get healthy, they see drastically different views. And I understand how frustrating that is for people. And that's one of the things that I like to try to break down into simplistic terms. And I hope we can talk about this a little bit more today, because I think epigenetics could also be playing a role too, because imagine if you're born in a womb that has you're exposed to higher levels of iodine, and then you supplement with iodine, your food contains iodine. It's like similar thing with PUFA accumulation. We've changed the fatty acid profile inside of us. We're accumulating iodine generation after generation after generation. And so I would love to dive into at some point in this conversation, like practical take-home points of how one can address their own iodine overload problems today.
Well, you just opened up half a dozen wonderful discussion points.
I know.
Yeah. Before we go there, I want to share one thing about Ashley.
Confused, right? Though. Like because there's people all over the internet saying you're deficient in iodine. Your thyroid problem is due to low iodine intake. And I think it's important for people to understand that could actually be causing them a lot of harm with their iodine supplementation. And that's one thing I appreciate about you is step one, maybe assess your supplements. Like, what do your supplements contain? What medications are you taking? Because that's an easy thing you can just take away potentially.
But it's also it's also, I'll let you go on. I want to just comment on this one thing. It's also the food. And I get a big portion of my food from Ashley's Farms. And the first thing I did was connect her after our interview and said, Ashley, what do you clean the breast of your cows with? And they were using iodine.
I think,
or some of them were, weren't they?
So for the audience, you have to clean teats, you have to clean milking equipment. That's just good practice, right?
Yeah.
And so unfortunately, another thing in addition to supplements and food and, iodine in our salt is we've also moved into iodine-based disinfectants kind of all over the place. And there are alternatives. It's just iodine has been widely accepted in the dairy industry as cleaning off the teats. So you do iodine teat dip. Well, I would say about 40% of our dairy producers were using iodine teat dip, but they were following that with the hot water rinse. So I'm not too concerned about it. However, I told them we're going to switch to just hydrogen peroxide with the warm water rinse or vinegar. So there's so many different options that you can use for perfectly acceptable disinfectants. It's just for some reason iodine, like you walk into like an agriculture store and you go to like dairy cleaning and iodine is the most common option there. So it's kind of just more a little bit education, and most dairy producers are not going to be upset about it. They'll just say, hey, can I just use up my current? Sure, of course. Do a hot water rinse after and then maybe switch to something like hydrogen peroxide.
So you bring up a really good point. Before you mentioned about how the truth is that, this has been fortified in ways that aren't really needed anymore. But the other side of this is that iodine, it's a really useful molecule in industrial applications. And because of that, along with fortification, there's a lot of industrial uses or process uses in which it's gotten into the food supply. So those are the main two avenues.
It's kind of like estrogen.
Yeah. And in Ashley's case, you're getting food from her and no idea that it's snuck in, the iodine snuck in through this route, unless you know the specific details to look for.
Yeah.
And you've covered almost all of them, though, in your book and in your work. Go ahead, Ashley. You have a retort to my comment.
Pigs are also heavily supplemented with iodine in their feed. And so if they're just using like a conventional feed, there's quite a bit of iodine added to that. And the amount in an egg can increase 5 to 10-fold based on if iodine is added to the feed. There's no iodine in our feed, I promise. That's a mineral I forgot to look at, which is a good thing, right? When I was formulating the feed. But they are also adding it to like beef cattle minerals as well. So just general mineral supplementation, which is a good thing for many livestock, but who is formulating these? Who's setting these barriers and requirements for micro minerals and iodine levels in these mineral packs? That to me is another concerning thing, because again, we go back to the 1920s, added iodine to the salt. Oops, here we are today, overloaded. So at what point are things and mineral packs going to change? I think it just more conversations with Dr. Christianson.
Well, I'd love to make one real high level comment early along too, is that I don't want iodine to come off as a villain or a bad guy or something that we need to avoid, because it's essential to life. We need some. The difficulty is that there are genetic variations. Ashley talked about the epigenetic changes. We know that there's variations in human iodine metabolism. We know humans are adapted to different iodine environments. And those who are adapted to lower iodine environments, they can't tolerate what's even a slight excess and amounts that are harmless for others. So many people genetically, and these are all the genes that correlate with those having risks for thyroid disease. So many have a genetic intolerance of slight excesses, and it's easy to get that slight excess. So that's kind of the high level picture that we're at.
I want to pivot back to that goiter because I'm still intrigued with that observation. I did not know that was true. That I thought that someone had this goiter, this enlarged thyroid, that almost always correlated with hypothyroidism.
No,
but it's not.
No, euthyroid goiter is quite common.
Downsides. Yeah, so that is the thyroid gland's response to lack of iodine. It tries to make more, and it's just not working more. So it just pumps. It's like exercise.
Well, that can be a driver of goiter. Iodine excess can be a driver of goiter, and in many cases, there's no clear trigger. Yeah.
Wow. So any ideas what causes it?
It correlates with exposure to alcohol and tobacco. There's also some gene correlations, but it's about 3 to 5% of most populations will develop goiters. If there's severe endemic iodine deficiency, the rates are higher. Severe iodine excess, rates are higher. It can overlap with hypothyroidism, but in most cases, there's normal thyroid function.
Not related.
Yeah,
not related.
Dr. Mercola, I think that Dr. Ray Pete has also mentioned like X-rays and radiation.
Oh,
Sure.
as
Yeah,
well.
more of a historical driver, but common thing in the past was that, radiation was used for swollen tonsils. And in those cases, just the free radical damage could trigger more damage to thyrocytes and more hypothyroidism and more thyroid enlargement, thyroid cancers.
Ooh, speaking of Dr. Ray Peat, one thing that I would like to discuss would be, it sounds like on your last interview that you are familiar with the work of Dr. Ray Peat. You're very familiar with the work of Dr. Broda Barnes.
I wouldn't say very familiar with Roy Peat's work in detail, just at the name, the fact he's around. I'm not in detail familiar with his work. Very familiar with Broda Barnes' work, but just to put that out there.
Yeah.
He's more familiar because he read Your Guide to Cellular Health.
Great. So I'm heavily influenced by the work of Dr. Broda Barnes as well. And granted, it was kind of in a different era. And so I think that's one of the things I've learned the most from you, Dr. Christianson, is, hey, maybe we need to take his work with a grain of salt, not
iodine salt.
Iodine-free salt. Maybe take it with a grain of salt, because for those unfamiliar with the work of Dr. Broda Barnes, he drastically improved people's health in the early 1900s by supplementing, adding thyroid to their protocols. And he used NDT, so desiccated thyroid. And you can't deny the results that he saw, right? He saw increasing body temperature measurements. He saw like resolution of symptoms. He even saw sometimes like structural changes in individuals' faces. His work and his book are pretty powerful. But now I start to question it a little bit, learning a little bit more about your work. And hey, thyroid supplementation shouldn't be mass, passed out. I think it is important that today's thyroid is largely just T4 prescriptions, whereas Broda Barnes was doing a little bit more NDT desiccated thyroid. But I was very curious. I had some notes. What are your thoughts on why he was seeing such improvements in health, improvements in symptoms when he was giving his patients desiccated thyroid?
Sure. Yeah. So many had myxedema, many had overt hypothyroidism, and thyroid replacement therapy makes a big difference for those symptoms. Yeah, very straightforward.
Okay. Another thought I had was maybe desiccated.
Let me just ask one question about the follow up on that. You mentioned natural desiccated thyroid, which is what Broda Barnes used, but I don't think that's even available today. Maybe they sell it, but is there a process where they actually take the active T3 out of that and it's just essentially T4?
No. Part of the United States Pharmacopoeia assays for natural desiccated thyroid requires roughly 9 micrograms of T3 per 1 grain dosage, give or take about 10%. In the production process, there's no place in which they can manipulate the hormone content. They assay it, and surprisingly, about half of the raw material cannot end up making it to final manufacture because they assay it and it's just out of spec. So they can't really fix it. They just throw it out and use another batch, basically.
And is that a prescription, or can you get that as an over-the-counter?
Well, kind of, sort of. So prescription porcine natural desiccated thyroid, we've got 3 brands right now in the United States. We've got Armour, Adthyza, and then NP thyroid. And those are standardized, as I mentioned. There are some over-the-counter versions. Tough thing is just the not standardized.
Oh, so the prescriptions are standardized. The over-the-counter ones are not.
Well, the prescription ones, again, more than half the batches get rejected when they're assayed. So we know that they're not effective. And even of those that are accepted, a certain amount do have post-production recall that occurs. So when they're watched, they're good. They're not perfect, but it does take a lot of analysis and assay. So the drawback about non-prescription is just if they're not assayed in some way, we don't know the quality control. There actually have been a few studies done of the over-the-counter versions in which they've been purchased and assayed, and they've had a pretty big, they have active hormone, but it's a pretty wide range.
So Broda Barnes he used Armour. And so another thought that I had was, hey, this was early 1900s. The cattle, the pigs, they weren't supplemented with iodine. So therefore their thyroids themselves contained low levels. Now we fast forward to 2024, soon to be 2025. All the livestock are supplemented with iodine. Potentially their thyroids are now overloaded with iodine, such as for many individuals. And so maybe the Armour and the NDT, the desiccated thyroids, are not comparable from early 1900s to today, and maybe they contain a lot more iodine. Are you aware of any testing of any of that?
Sure. So actually, the raw material is first assayed based upon iodine content, and it's standardized for 0.2% iodine in the raw material for natural desiccated thyroid. The prescription forms are always porcine. There's really just two manufacturers of the raw material. 1980, the real big shift away from natural desiccated thyroid occurred because the standardizing, so there's first assay for the raw material, which still is iodine based. Then there's standardizing per hormone content, and that's the second step. The second step didn't occur before about 1985. And in 1980, the problem was that you could standardize natural thyroid per iodine content, but not all the iodine was in the T4 and the T3. 4 and 3 are how many iodine atoms are present. There's a lot of iodine separate and in thyroglobulin and in other thyronomines. So you could standardize iodine and you would get an approximation of active hormone, but far from perfect. And there's a couple of editorials in JAMA about people who were on treatment for hypothyroidism, which should have been therapeutic, but clearly was not based upon their clinical presentation. They were still symptomatic and their scores were way off. And this was the big push for synthetic T4 only. And the advantage that it had in that era was that all the iodine in synthetic T4 was in the active hormone. So if you standardized per iodine content, you were standardizing per active hormone. And that was a totally valid argument back in 1980 during the Carter administration. But it's not a valid argument today because the standardizing is based on active hormone, and that's written up in the United States Pharmacopoeia.
Got it. Well, I think many of the, pro-metabolic bioenergetic groups these days still do encourage or, recommend from time to time the use of thyroid hormone supplementation. I have seen it help a number of individuals, but I do think there seems to be a very fine line. And you brought up a good point. Dr. Broda Barnes in the early 1900s, he saw it helped a lot of people. I would say in the bioenergetic space, there kind of is a gray area of diagnosing hypothyroidism versus subclinical hypothyroidism. And I would say you potentially would say that someone with subclinical hypothyroidism should not be on thyroid supplementation.
Well, I make a distinction too between whether something might help someone and whether it may cause long-term harm in ways that might not be apparent. And this would be a difficulty with really everything that has been done until just the very recent past. We're seeing more and more data saying that taking hormones from outside the body, people can feel better, people can benefit in various ways from symptoms, and even with normal levels, still may have certain complications. So if someone feels better, that's always a win. They've always improved their health in some way. But I'd love to have that happen in a way that doesn't take away from their long-term health.
Because what Dr. Broda Barnes would talk about would be like taking some level of thyroid and monitoring your body temperature, waiting 1 to 2 weeks, and then adjusting to try to reach 98.6 degrees Fahrenheit. So that's commonly the discussion of, taking exogenous thyroid to boost metabolic rate. And so I think the biggest takeaway I've learned from you, Dr. Christianson, is maybe there are long-term consequences to relying on that. So
yes,
I think step one for someone would be, how does one assess that they potentially need thyroid hormone support or they don't need thyroid hormone support? Like, what is an actual reason why they should be on it?
Well, a distinction I would make is, whether it seems to help empirically, it wouldn't be a clear sign that it's safe or beneficial. And at some point, the interventions that we can have in natural medicine, like thyroid hormones, they can have non-specific stimulant effects. Someone could take cocaine and feel more energized, but not be healthier from that. So yeah, I'd pull apart benefits from that. So in terms of categories in which the benefit outweighs the risk, that really starts with overt hypothyroidism. So when we look at the body's chemistry and we see abnormalities, the question to ask is that a compensation or is that a failure? Is that something where the body is doing its best to make do of the current situation, or have all the backup mechanisms collapsed? And in the case of overt hypothyroidism, yeah, the brain is begging the thyroid to work. This is Kirk yelling at Mr. Scott. We got to get to warp, Scotty. We got to get to warp. Give me more. And Scott's like, but Captain, the engines can't take anymore. So yeah, there's a point at where things decompensate. And there, the body is no longer in homeostasis. It doesn't have the balance it's trying to achieve. And in that case, external interventions, they're causing more benefit than they are causing harm. And that's where we're at with overt hypothyroidism. That's clearly the case when TSH levels are well over 20 and T4 levels are well below range. There's gray cases that are edging on that, but that's clearly a situation in which there's more benefit than harm.
If someone has been on...
Wait, let me just put a question here, though, because you brought up a point, Ashley, about the diagnosis, and the Broda-Barnes focus was on the temperature. And in our last conversation, we discussed actually you discussed, and I learned that unless you have an unusual situation with respect to having your thyroid removed or coming off a thyroid hormone replacement, that really don't need to measure the thyroid hormones. There's almost no benefit to it. But what's really crucial is to measure the thyroid antibodies, which is strongly suggestive of the cause of almost all hypothyroidism, which is the autoimmune disease. So how do you pair that against the recommendations by Broda-Barnes and many others to measure their temperatures, because basal body temperature, because I have not had a lot of good success with that. And I was taking thyroid hormone replacement. I'm not now since our last conversation. I'm off of it completely. But yeah, how do you reconcile that body temperature, especially when you have a low temperature?
Back in Barnes' day, so 1972, everything changed for thyroid assessment. That's when we learned about how to actually measure.
Really?
Yeah. 3 pivotal things happened. We were first able to assay high sensitive TSH scores. We were able to assay T3 for the first time. Then we were able to learn that T3 was mostly peripherally metabolized. Those all happened within like a few months. So this massive shift occurred in our understanding. During his time, we didn't know any of that. And there weren't. There was quotes from 1918 saying, if someone has these symptoms suggestive of mixed edema, why not just give some natural thyroid extract? Funny thing, but in the earliest days, there was natural desiccated thyroid, there was thyroid extract, and there was thyroid feeding, and there were thyroglobulin. So there's like 4 completely different versions. Thyroid feeding was pretty much just like steak tartare, but thyroid tissue. So it was done in a lot of ways way back when.
Eat a whole fish head.
Well, yeah, they would take thyroid tissue that was just desiccated and not even processed, just chopped up, just minced basically.
Wow.
Yeah. So, but in Barnes' day, the difficulty was that, and the quote that I was alluding to from 1918 said, hey, if someone has all these symptoms that are looking like myxedema, give them some version of thyroid and see if it helps. And in that era, that was reasonable, given what they knew and given their predictive powers, that was totally reasonable. And there was a lot of non-specific signs that correlated with hypothyroidism before it was obvious, before it was at the point of myxedema, and basal body temperature was affected by that. Since Barnes's time, we've learned that the thyroid basal body temperature connections are very real, but they're not as linear. They're not as tight as one might think. So many who are overtly hypothyroid will have a lower basal body temperature. And during hyperthyroid storm, people often elicit a febrile response. But there's not a linear increase in basal body temperature as one moves further into hyperthyroidism. That wasn't understood during Barnes's time. He thought that you could use the basal body temperature to titrate the dose of thyroid. And sadly, he died from thyroid overdose. That was probably a big part of it. But we now know that, during thyroid storm, there's a fever, but there's not a ratcheting up of temperature as you're getting closer and closer to that.
So maybe that's why he had to wait 2 weeks after the thyroid supplementation to wait for that to come.
Yeah. So your clinical experience, have you ever found benefit to measuring basal body temperature?
If we were back in the olden days and it was one more sign along with things, but currently I don't use it for assaying whether someone needs thyroid hormone or whether they're on a good dose of thyroid hormone.
So I have seen, I've worked with a number of individuals that come from a very restrictive background. So of course, in the modern day diet culture, wanting to be extra model, thin, skinny, lean, there are many women who have been on periods of like very restrictive diets. And like I'm talking prolonged eating 1,200 calories. And from improving their metabolic rate, we do see a rise in their body temperature as their energy production starts to increase because heat is a byproduct there. And so I've seen it correlate with improved health and just energy production. But I think what you're saying is potentially with thyroid supplementation, there isn't a direct line.
What you're saying is spot on. So when someone's in a starvation response, their metabolism is impaired in a lot of ways. They can have a lower temperature. They can be centrally hypothyroid, meaning their brain is putting less of a signal on their thyroid than expected. And they can be peripherally hypothyroid. These are all compensations. They're not failures. They're compensations. They're all ways the body is compensating for having just too little fuel available.
Because when I was carnivore, low carb, my body temperature was 96.5 degrees Fahrenheit. And now I'm in the 98s, adding a lot of carbohydrates with an improved metabolism. And so maybe it can just be a sign of general energy metabolism,
Totally.
But maybe it's the best metric and tool right now for assessing thyroid health.
Well, another tough thing just to throw in with body temperature is, where should someone's temperature be and what is a normal healthy body temperature? Our reflex is always 98.6. That's from about a century old German paper. That's not considered a normal, healthy ideal. Not that it's bad, but there's just such a larger range of normal than was thought 100 years ago.
Well, what do you think that range is?
It's probably a solid 4 or 5 degrees, and it encompasses.
Really?
Yeah.
Wow.
And it goes a little above 98.6, but quite a ways below it for normal, healthy adults. Of course, menstruation affects that greatly, and many other things can as well. But if you're 98.6, it's not the law anymore.
Okay. So curious on the best metrics to assess your thyroid and iodine status. And so what I've gauged from you would be, getting those antibody tests done on thyroid, not necessarily T4, T3, TSH, get the antibody test. But then also, I'm very curious to learn more about this urinary iodine to creatinine ratio test. Yeah. From listening to your work, it seems like those two are really good things to monitor as you're making changes to your diet, lifestyle, supplement. Can you talk a little bit about how those can be used as metrics?
For sure. So nothing bad about the thyroid functional test, TSH, T4, T3, but yeah, they're not predictive for most people of symptoms. There's such a loose correlation between them and thyroid symptoms. The antibodies are more predictive. They're more commonly correlating with symptoms and risks. And simple thing, Joe mentioned about antithyroid peroxidase, antithyroid globulin. There's a couple of others that are available, but those are two by far the most common and most typical that are evaluated. Iodine assessment, this is a tricky thing. And for the last century, there have been tons of researchers just, pulling their hair out to what are the best ways to gauge nutritional status of iodine. And there's a lot of good tools for populations. But because there's so much intra and inter individual variability, there's really no great tools for individuals. Once you're measuring 500 people, it doesn't matter how bad that individual test is, you can gauge that group and make sense out of the group. But applied to individuals, there really aren't metrics and there aren't tests that say, are you getting too much or too little? But there are good tests to see if you're at a therapeutic range, if you're trying to help your thyroid. So if you're trying to reverse a thyroid problem, you can then see if you're at a range in which that's likely to help. And that's the urinary iodine to creatinine ratio.
Dr. Mercola, have you ran that test yet?
No, I haven't. Yeah. Actually, in our new health coach system, I wasn't really going to focus on that too much because it's not technically it's not that difficult. Compliance to it is somewhat of a challenge because you have to typically make sure you're married to a gallon jug for 24 hours.
To be precise, it does require a 24-hour test. But further to your point, the test is not a mandatory thing. Probably the most useful way to gauge one's status is just by being aware of one's intake. If you do a good inventory of your intake from salt, food, supplements, personal care products, you can pretty well know what you're ingesting.
Yeah. And that's free and and curative too. It's so easy. You kill two birds with one stone.
So I think that's another thing I appreciate about your work, Dr. Christianson, is like there are practical take-home steps. Like you outline them and how crucial diet is. Can you talk a little bit about, because we were mentioning earlier, body temperature when you're on a low carb when you're in a starvation state, your body temperature down regulates as like a protective mechanism to down regulate energy production. When it comes to low carbohydrates, how have you seen that impact iodine status, thyroid health, because there's this message in the low carb space that it's well documented that your T3 is lowered when you're on a low carb diet. But many advocates say that that's just the body becoming more sensitive to it, and your reliance on ketones and a change in your body's like energy utilization, glucose versus ketones and fatty acids, that kind of diminishes the need for higher T3. What has been your experience with someone going low iodine, but also low carbohydrate in improving their thyroid status?
Well, so as a separate variable, everything you mentioned is spot on. Carbohydrate intake itself can correlate with the body's metabolic rate. And this correlates with insulin production. There's so many times in which insulin is at an excess, but if it's far too low, that can impair the peripheral activation of thyroid hormones. And the body can sometimes see extremely low insulin as a proxy for starvation, even if there's not a deficit of caloric intake. Even if someone's eating enough food, but insulin is far too low, their body can start eliciting a starvation response. One of the more dramatic studies was on children put on a ketogenic diet for seizures. And in the study, it was adolescent kids. In the population, the normal baseline rate of hypothyroidism, overt hypothyroidism, is about 1 in 1,250. So pretty rare, less than 1 in 1,000. But during the course of a 2-month ketogenic diet for seizures, the rate of overt hypothyroidism warranting thyroid medication was 27%. So yeah, the one variable was that control groups that were medicated that still had seizures but were not on the ketogenic diet didn't have a higher rate of hypothyroidism. So that was one of the more dramatic studies. And we've seen other ones in pediatric populations and others in adult populations that are showing similar results. If one's intake of carbohydrate is radically low, even on a eukaloric intake, then yeah, there are central ways and peripheral ways in which thyroid hormones are downregulated.
Dr. Mercola, do you have any follow-up questions there about?
No. Oh, you can go ahead. Go ahead.
Okay. Well, then I'm curious. So let's say someone believes that they're in a hypothyroid state. Their thyroid antibody tests are elevated and they want to make actionable steps forward. I think hopefully that data you shared encouraged people to include carbohydrates that work well for you, support your body's energy metabolism. Insulin is not the bad man that people lend it to be. Of course, we don't want it to be elevated all day long,
Right.
but spikes in insulin are important for normal functioning, including converting T4 into active thyroid hormone T3 throughout the body. And so it's not something we need to be afraid of. So can you talk a little bit more about the low iodine diet that you recommend for people to follow for 1 to 3 months? Because I did some playing around on Chronometer, and I have concerns about choline, biotin, calcium, C15, and a few other nutrients on a low iodine diet. So I was going to pick your brain on your thoughts on how to mitigate those deficiencies in this phase.
Yeah, those are all excellent points. And to draw upon that, the studies that I've cited were studies that were not meant to put people on a diet that was ideal for their long-term health. It was something that was done short-term for one specific reason. And when I wrote the Thyroid Reset Diet, I did my best to think about it in ways to where if someone were on a diet like this for 3, 6, or 9 months, how can it be more nutritionally sound? How can they cover the bases more thoroughly? You brought up several excellent points. And the drawback is that most people, their sources of choline, C15, calcium are correlated with sources that are quite high in iodine from commercial sources. So if people have more sources of eggs and dairy that don't have unusual amounts of iodine, that can make it even easier for them to maintain nutritional validity. And if your work is providing that, that'd be a wonderful benefit for us all.
I was honestly, before your work, I didn't even know that eggs and dairy could be high in iodine. It's just not talked about. And I pulled up quite a few studies. Like, it is alarming the difference in iodine levels between what the animals are fed, what they're supplemented with, and disinfectants and what they're cleaned with. And I like, for example, potassium iodide and calcium iodate. Those are two very common things that dairy cows are supplemented with in their feed ration. So like in a confinement dairy, the cows are in kind of more barn stalls and they're fed a daily ration. So it's to the science, right? Like these confinement barns operate very efficiently. They know exactly how much all cows eat, what they need to get each day. So they're formulated in their buckets that they eat out of. And I had no idea the amount of iodine that these dairy cows are intaking through their daily rations. And again, is this like an oops thing? Just like how the government added salt to our iodine, we're now loading animals with iodine. And I had no idea that this had the results that it does. Like you can, like I said earlier, you can increase the amount in eggs by 5 to 10 fold just by having iodine in the feed. And with dairy, there were some that were, 10 to 15 fold, depending on the combination of what they ate, what the disinfectant was used to clean off the milk equipment or care. So I guess just yet another reason to know where your food comes from, to know your farmer, to ask these questions. But can you touch briefly on so be mindful of your dairy, where your dairy's coming from, your egg intake. What are other high iodine sources? Oh, seafood.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, ocean-based seafood.
Okay.
Back to your last point, just two more things to highlight upon. One of which is that the amount in those foods is incredibly variable. There's some samples that don't really have inappropriate amounts, but many do. So when I put foods in those green, yellow, and red light categories, the thought wasn't what is the average intake or what is the licit intake from one source, but really from many, many sources, what's a reasonable possible amount that could be exposed to. And if someone could get too much, I would call those red light foods. One more thing I'd love your feedback on. Many of the sources I read also talked about fish meal as being a common protein source for some cattle feed and just being as one additional source of iodine in that. I don't know how common of a practice that is.
It is a common practice. And the reason being is that fish meal is a byproduct of the fish industry. And the conventional food system doesn't let anything go to waste, right? Nothing goes to waste. So byproducts are used in other agricultural areas as like waste, right? So yes, fish meal is added to a number of dairy feeds as well. Even chicken and swine production. It kind of depends on. Now there is wild caught fish meal, and then there's seafood, ocean-based fish meal, and then there's factory farmed fish meal. So that can vary quite a bit as well. But that's another source as well. And sea kelp is a really big new thing for cows. So kelp, seaweed supplementation, and it's relatively new. So I've read a lot of like USDA agriculture books from like 1800s, early 1900s, and none of this stuff was talked about. They didn't use any of this stuff. And that's a whole nother rabbit hole of, the talk about soil depletion and people believing that soil is low in iodine. I don't buy it. I think that the soil microbiome is shut off, and that makes certain minerals not accessible to plants. And so how we test the mineral content in soil these days is a little bit questionable sometimes. If people are interested, they can look more into like Haney and regenerative agriculture testing and Gabe Brown, where they talk about when you test soil properly, it actually does contain minerals. They may just not be accessible because the biology has been shut off by all of our heavy agricultural toxic chemical use. But yeah, so there's been a belief that the soil is depleted in iodine, and then that's led to a rapid increase in supplementation of iodine sources, which I would say that sea kelp is a little bit more common than the fish meal, though.
Yeah. Can I just comment on that? It really shocks me and surprised and shocked that people could be absolutely committed and putting lots of time, effort, and resources to eating as healthy as possible, absolutely no processed food in their diet. Yet because of these stealth sources of iodine that no one is aware of, virtually no one, you're getting loads of iodine that never were before because of the confusion, the inability to think this thing through clearly that all animals need iodine supplements. And obviously we are what we eat, and many of us are eating the animals that are overloaded with iodine. So there's I don't know, are there any practical strategies that you could use? I mean, that we have a sort of an insider with Ashley is with the farming industry, but do you have any recommendations you found to identify low sources of these food products?
Yeah, when I wrote the book, I identified which are the biggest outliers, which always have a lot or which may have a lot, and I called those the red light foods. And people who are prone to thyroid disease are better off really avoiding those, or if possible, getting those from sources where we know aren't going to have excess amounts. And then I identified the yellow light foods, those that have moderate amounts but are rather consistent, that don't vary significantly. And those are things to where once someone has improved thyroid function, I encourage them to add those back in measured quantities for more nutritional completeness.
So I think that that's an important point that you say right there, because in the modern health space, we don't need more food fears. We don't need more
Amen.
Living in a state of fight or flight, afraid of things. And I think that that's the most empowering thing that you have documented in your work, Dr. Christianson, which is, hey, for a period of time, keep your iodine intake low, let the body detox its iodine. And then when you get to a new baseline, your body's a lot more resilient to handle iodine in intakes that the body's designed to handle. The problem is we're kind of in this new era where supplementing iodine all over our body is like a very common thing. So I think that that's the most freeing thing, and it's something important for people to keep in mind. It's never a forever thing. It's a, hey, we need to assess the iodine status in your body. Potentially you're overloaded. Give your body the time it needs to detox it. And then once it does, then these aren't foods you should be afraid of. They're foods you should always try to know where the sourcing is and where it's coming from. But I don't think it's something we have to be fearful of in the long run. But it's just unfortunate, like you said, Dr. Mercola, people could be putting in so much work and they're still so frustrated with hidden iodine in our personal care products, in supplements that we use that we don't know.
Well, in food.
And in food.
That's where it's absolutely stealth.
Yeah.
Unless you understand those.
So I found a study that showed eggs from pasture-raised chicken with no iodine in their diet can have 5 micrograms per egg. That's very low. So
yes,
very low. Like there's more iodine in potatoes. Whereas eggs supplemented.
That's kind of a funny one.
Oh, true.
Yeah.
True. Whereas eggs supplemented with iodine can have 100 micrograms per egg. That's a crazy difference.
Up to 250 in some samples. Yeah.
Oh my gosh.
250. Yeah.
That's crazy. If you have 4, you're at a gram.
Yeah.
No,
milligram.
A milligram.
A full milligram.
Yeah.
I'm getting my eggs tested, so that's going to be sent in the beginning of the year. But I'm hoping we're 5 because there's no iodine source in their feed.
I would love to hear the results from that, Ashley. I'd love to have some sources to point people at.
Yeah, she's got some of the best eggs out there, and more importantly, well, I'm not sure that you consider iodine a poison because it is indeed a beneficial nutrient, but one that it almost never is a beneficial nutrient is omega-6 polyunsaturated fats. Now, yes, there is an argument that it's an essential fat, but there's another argument that it's not, because if you're eating food, it is physiologically impossible to not get enough omega-6. It's impossible because you only need like 500 milligrams. And even food that has virtually no fat in it has more than enough. So yes, your body can't make it, and that's why they call it essential. But the reality is, it's impossible to not get enough.
You may or may not know this, but the only times that deficiency has been demonstrated were when babies are fed nothing but skim milk and no other fat source, or when people are on total parenteral nutrition, like all the nutrients are IV and there's no fat intake. But barring that, you're right, you really can't get fatty acid deficient.
You can't. It's impossible.
And omega-6s are very similar to the iodine case, Dr. Christianson, where like early 1900s, we were exposed to such lower amounts. Now it's like, oh my gosh, we are overloaded in everything. They've changed the types of fat inside animals that we eat. It's another oops, right? Like our butter has become margarine. It's wild. It's wild what these like huge campaigns can do to change the food system. It's really unfortunate.
Now, there's one clinical condition that you're familiar with, and I would really love to hear your feedback on. and that is the concern of iodine radiation and causing thyroid cancer. And by this, I'm talking about radioactive iodine emitted from nuclear blasts or explosions or fallout. So, and almost the universal recommendation is to take massive amounts of iodine. I don't even know what the amount is, but it's a large amount. And it's just, so I would really love to hear your view on that, because and the potential dangers of implementing that, because so many people, they have that high, they got that iodine bottle just ready to take it if there's a nuclear fallout.
Yeah, I was just speaking to a big group of doctors in Toronto not too long ago. So Toronto is the epicenter of thyroid cancer in North America, and their power plants are a big part of that. So exposure to radioactive iodine, the radioactive iodine can build up within the thyroid and decades down the road raise the risk for thyroid cancers. Now, the mechanism by which high dose iodine helps is a useful mechanism to be aware of. When you take a lot of iodine, you stop your thyroid from working. You stop it from doing anything, including absorbing iodine. Now, the World Health Organization has mapped out exactly what circumstances it helps to take prophylactic iodine for radioactive iodine exposure. And the age of the person involved and the timing of exposure are so narrow that there's pretty much never a case where it's helpful. If you're below 14 years of age, if you're below 14 years of age and you know in advance that you have a 24-hour window of exposure, then you can use a dose of about 5 milligrams of iodine, which is a lot, and you can cut your long-term risk of thyroid cancer. Once you're past that age, or if you don't know your exposure window within 24 hours, there's no benefit. There's way more harm than benefit. And yeah, you're right. Everyone just panics and takes this stuff, but it's been mapped out how and when it helps, and it's extremely narrow and precise.
So essentially forget about it. What doses they recommend? Is it 5 milligrams, or is it much higher?
It's weight-based and age-based, but it ranges between about 1,000 micrograms and about 10 milligrams. And it depends upon, but again, your timing of exposure has to be known. So there's really no situations which you know within a 24-hour window when you're going to be exposed to this stuff.
Or you can just eat a normal processed food diet and eat some not whole wheat, but white bread that has about 1 milligram in each slice.
Right. But the problem is that ongoing exposure to iodine doesn't have that same effect. You only need it's a singular dose that's timed with your 24-hour window of exposure. It's not that you take it all the time and it's protective. It's you have a single dose that's timed right before a 24-hour window of exposure.
Well, thank you. I was really curious about that after our last conversations. I should have asked him about that.
Yeah. Fukushima brought that back to the news again. And I wrote about that quite a bit back then.
Yeah.
Wow. It's almost like it's a hormetic effect.
Oh, it is.
Some people, would view as helpful. But if you take a step back, it's like, wait, what are you doing to your thyroid?
It's just such a narrow window. We always assume that the effects of a nutrient are linear, that if a lack of a nutrient makes you tired, the more and more you take, the more energy you have. And that's almost never the case. I think about nutrients like keys to a car. If they're missing, the car won't go. But once the key is there, more keys won't make the car go faster.
That is really great. And I think that's like an important thing for people to realize in their diet, because I was at the store the other day and I overheard a conversation, someone saying like, I visited my doctor the other day and they were just talking about how we're all deficient in iodine these days and it's a huge problem. And they got me on an iodine supplement that I start next week. And this is a pervasive message that is happening right now. And it's dangerous. And that's the really sad thing, because people are doing it in pursuit of health. And people saying that we're low in iodine, it's not any bad intentions, right? It's just, this is the messaging, but it's having consequences on our long-term health, and it sounds alarming.
Plausible. There certainly is a relationship that way, and it's also something that's an easy message to go viral. There's this big problem, and one simple nutrient can help it and fix it, and it's just more complex than that.
Yeah, it sounds natural.
Right.
Oh yeah, iodine, great. Let's do iodized salt. Yeah, let's have some more. Give me seconds and thirds.
And it's similar to the omega-6 PUFAs. It's actually impossible to not eat enough iodine unless, like you said, you're a raw vegan.
Right.
That doesn't salt any of your food and you're just eating raw vegetables.
Yeah, there have been about half a dozen documented sources of iodine deficiency in the last several decades. And I diagnosed one of them.
A half a dozen?
Half a dozen, yeah. And Ashley mentioned most of the circumstances. Most involved people that were on mono diets of a cruciferous vegetable and like no other food. Many had portions of the gastrointestinal tract removed for surgical reasons. But I saw one young man who was consuming, his whole food intake was raw vegetables and mostly raw broccoli, like 2-3 pounds of raw broccoli per day in a blender and no other food. And he did that for about 3-4 months. He did develop an iodine deficient goiter. He did have some compensatory changes. And yeah, I just told him to knock it off and eat normal food and eat healthy food and take care of yourself. And he was fine. So yeah.
Eating blended broccoli.
Yeah.
He got a lot of vitamin K1 for sure.
Oh gosh. Okay, so I hope the listeners understand, I think just kind of assessing your day-to-day on your iodine sources is important. The one issue that I see is that Chronometer doesn't always track iodine. So the USDA database always doesn't test iodine. It's a really hard nutrient to say, oh, I'm getting X amount per day. It's almost impossible to dial that in. So in order for the body to naturally detox our stored iodine that we may be dealing with, that may be causing thyroid problems, is there a max iodine intake level that you would recommend? But even so, how do you even monitor such a thing? And does that kind of scale with metabolism? So as an example, I'm 130 pounds, but I eat a lot of food, like upwards above 2,500 calories, whereas someone who's eating 1,600, 1,500 calories, does the iodine intake, it has to scale a little bit with metabolic rate in terms of your body's natural ability to detoxify it?
Well, it does scale with body mass, with body size.
Okay.
But in amounts that aren't that huge. Now, 2 questions you asked: what was best ranges and what's the best way to know? So best way to know, I mentioned about just having a sense about your total intake. In the Thyroid Reset Diet, I've got some quizzes, iodine inventory quizzes. Iodineinventory.com is a free little online app. You can put your food, your supplements, your meds. It's in Thyroid Meds too. And it'll give you a good approximation of what your daily intake is. Those are probably the most useful ways to know what you're getting. In terms of how much amounts are healthiest, there's a range between roughly 20 and 200 micrograms that correlates with the lowest rate of adult onset thyroid disease. If someone has had thyroid problems or seeking to improve them, the short-term goal is staying below 100 micrograms.
Okay. And so knowing where, I think the biggest source would be like, if you're eating out at restaurants all the time, you're probably eating iodized salt, like a lot of it. If you're doing high PUFA, high iodized salt, any packaged food is going to have iodine added into it. Any grain products from the store, the grain, the flour that's used is often contains iodine in it as well. A lot of fortification, iodine addition with packaged food. And that's an unfortunate
thing. To that
thing.
Exact point you made, something that really had a big effect upon me was looking at studies showing that there's a lot of iodine in processed grains for sure. And some processed grains will say contains iodized dough conditioners. However, many that don't say that have just as much, if not more, iodine when they're assayed. So the mind-blowing thing that I learned from that one little point was that as much as there is not to love with a long ingredient list on processed foods, not everything's on the ingredient list.
They can clump a lot into random terms. Those labels are not regulated as much as people think they are.
Not comprehensive.
No. So basically, I think that those are kind of 2 big things. Like, don't eat out as much. Don't eat food with an ingredient list. Prioritize home cooked meals. So that would be like step 1.
Well, and personal care products. Which is another stealth source. And I got a question on your thyroid quiz. Is that something you created?
It is.
Okay, and then how did you, because it's so challenging to find accurate resources, and we're compiling,
Food
I have
Buddy.
I know with an app, Mercola Health Coach app, and part of that is the Food Buddy, and we've downloaded 50 million data entries. And I actually kind of it wisely advised me that we need to cut that down, and we are in the process of doing that. But even with that amount of data, there's a lot of confusion or data, and a lot of them don't even measure the iodine. So, and then you don't, you can have an egg, we already discussed, it could be 5 milligrams or 250
Right.
milligrams. So what egg do you use? It depends on what you're eating. So it's almost impossible to identify what's in your food unless you, anything but almost broadly and generically, as you've done with your red,
Yeah.
yellow, and green foods. But how did you figure it out with your quiz? That's the curiosity I have.
The iodine quiz is in terms of gauging one's iodine intake. Is that what you're asking?
Yes.
So
yes.
yeah.
Yes.
So
yes.
basically, that was seeing which food categories are eaten with which frequency.
Okay.
Yeah, and it's a
and
and
you
it
just
is
but
and in terms of having a
but
precise. I'm sorry. Go ahead, Joe.
how'd you get the data? I mean, if the data isn't really there, I mean, how do you figure this thing out? I mean, it's a big conundrum.
There are databases that exist. There was about 638 foods identified and about 50 assays for each one. So I did averaging and statistical analysis of them. And some foods had very consistent moderate amounts, some had consistent negligible amounts, and some foods were just highly variable or always high. So yeah, the highly variable or always high got a red light, and the consistently moderate got a yellow light, and the consistently low got a green light.
I found the studies that Dr. Christianson used, and Dr. Mercola, there are some that are very well done because of how serious some people have to keep their iodine intake low before surgeries, certain surgeries. So there is some high quality data, but I'm almost convinced that one has to just run their own reports run their own tests these days to build a new database, because the USDA food database is all over the place.
Well, and part of it in this case is just how capricious iodine is itself. It's so volatile, and it varies so much from sample to sample and season to season. So you can make broad approximations, but you can't make precise amounts. And that's adequate. Broad approximations are good enough to keep someone stable or reverse things when there is a problem.
Yeah.
And you've been doing this for 2 decades, so your clinical experience validates this approach works, and that's what counts. You want a strategy that's going to win for you, and you're going to get you the results you're seeking.
3 decades, please. don't take away one.
Oh, I'm sorry. I didn't mean it. Okay. Sorry about that.
So don't eat. Limit restaurant intake. Limit processed food. Assess your supplements. Stop iodine supplementation. Assess your personal care products. Something that I learned is that many common acne treatments contain a lot of iodine because, again, the antifungal, antimicrobial beliefs. And so really assess what you're putting on your skin daily. And then it's time to kind of be a little bit more critical of your day-to-day food choices, which Dr. Christianson has a green light, yellow light, red light. My biggest concern is that if someone just goes on the green light, like I mentioned earlier, the nutrients of choline, biotin, calcium, C15, and a few others. And so if you can know where your eggs and dairy come from, know those sources, ask questions about supplementation, cleanliness of the udders, and all of that. But if that stresses someone out too much, if they don't have access to high quality eggs, high quality dairy, then like Dr. Mercola said, Dr. Christianson has 3 decades of success showing that, hey, a short-term period of low iodine intake can solve a lot of problems. And so primarily stick to the green and yellow foods on your list. After 3 months, potentially reassess things, get potentially the iodine to creatinine ratio test and your thyroid antibodies tested. Is that kind of like a rough summary?
Great synopsis. In the book, I talked about those very nutrients being problems for those who are doing it for longer periods of time and some other ways to work around. But I'd rather people have good whole food options for that.
And that's why, like, if you can include eggs and dairy from a source you trust, you can cover those nutrients so easily.
And you just happen to know a source of that, and it will be validated by testing, objective laboratory testing.
I'm trying. We will increase, slowly scale, because I'm big on no factory farming, small scale, small farms, and so partnering with more of those. But I do think that just creating more awareness around the iodine as well can help maybe open others' eyes up with how they run their dairy operation or what they feed their chickens or things like that, because it's having profound implications, unfortunately.
Yeah.
I do have one more question on the supplementation, because I know in the bioenergetic space, there are a lot of people who are on thyroid support, and it's not just T4. I think that there's so much documented data showing T4 only is not helpful. Unfortunately, it's causing harm, and the conventional literature shows that T4 only thyroid medication is causing a lot of harm. What Dr. Christianson brings in is, hey, there's health implications to long-term desiccated or T3 thyroid supplementation as well. Because what I learned from you is that when you're on thyroid medication, that prevents your body's natural iodine detoxification mechanisms, or it downregulates it slightly. And so given that we're now all exposed to significantly higher levels of iodine today than we were earlier, that could potentially lead to problems as well. So if someone is on thyroid meds, T4 plus T3 combo, or desiccated or T3, what is your biggest advice and advice on like mental outlook on, okay, how long is it going to take to get off this? What are practical steps to titrating down? Because that's a serious, that it's not something that you can just snap overnight and be off.
For sure. Yeah. So the high level idea is that taking a hormone is not the same as making a hormone. You know, taking it is not making it. And even if it's bioidentical, even if the blood levels are the same as they would be in healthy people, taking a hormone is not the same as making a hormone. You know, our body has countless ways that we know of that regulate hormone byproducts, uptake, metabolism, mitochondrial usage. And that's the known unmeasurables, but there's unknown unknowns that go on forever. And when we're doing something from outside the body, we just lose more of that autonomy. So the first thought is just if someone needs it long term. And if they do, they should do amounts that are the best match to their body's normal physiology, you know, healthy levels and natural forms ideally. If it's not something someone needs long term, I would think through, if it's helping in some way, what are some other ways that one could achieve those same goals? Are there other unmasked, unidentified problems that are causing the symptoms? Are there other issues that it's kind of covering up? And then if it's not needed, what's the best time frame and process? There have been a couple of large studies on deprescribing of thyroid medications. And of course, someone's got to have a thyroid to consider that. You know, if a thyroid was removed or ablated by radioactive iodine, there's no remnant tissue left. And people need therapy longer term. But most with a thyroid can successfully take less or none. It is best to work with a prescriber. Most protocols are done over roughly 2 months, and typically doses are decreased in a 25% every other week fashion over 2 months. And it does take working with someone to know how to interpret the findings. We talked earlier in the green room about how if someone tapers quickly, their TSH goes up. That's a good sign. That's a normal, healthy sign. Some doctors don't get that and they panic. So yeah, most who are on meds they don't need long-term can take less or none. And you want to do as little intervention as possible with the body.
Yes, and so the green room discussion was about me personally going off of thyroid, and instead of the 2 months, of course, I like to do things quickly, so I went off in 2 weeks. But I did it. Well, first of all, I'm biologically quite optimally healthy. But in addition to that, I had a little secret sauce that I wanted to discuss with you, and that is photobiomodulation, which is the use of red, or more properly in this context, near infrared, because red itself only penetrates a few millimeters and will not get to the thyroid gland. So you need at least 810 area or even 1050 to go deeper. So that's a big part of it. But if you give with that frequency over your thyroid gland with enough energy, and many units don't have enough energy, or they've got an unfocused way to put the light in there. But if you use the right energy and you get it in there, there's really good evidence in the literature to show this works. And it worked for me personally. I've had no symptoms going off of this at all in 2 weeks, and it normally takes 2 months.
Well,
so, go ahead. I want to get your input.
Yeah, there's literature on low-level laser therapy helping thyroid autoimmunity, decrease requirement for medications. It's thought that the most central mechanism is that it helps the internal production of antioxidants by the thyroid. So the thyroid gland, it's processing this highly volatile molecule, iodine, and it's a big source of free radicals. That's why it's an effective antiseptic. So in processing it, the thyroid is hugely dependent upon antioxidants like glutathione and superoxide dismutase. And the thyroid both generates antioxidants and has a lot of mechanisms to take up antioxidants made by the liver cells. So it's flooded with those, and it needs that. But when it's at a level of iodine that it can't tolerate, those mechanisms get overwhelmed, and there's then cellular damage. So yeah, low-level laser therapy is one more way that may improve that antioxidant status while someone's thyroid is getting better.
Yeah, that's actually LLT is the older name when it first came out. Now it's more accurately referred to as photobiomodulation, which is more generic because most of that therapy is administered by LEDs, not lasers, and it's a lot less expensive to do it that way. I mean, I've got an actual laser, like a 15-watt laser, that's like $30,000 for that. But there's you don't have to spend a tiny fraction of the good LED unit. But there is another mechanism though, and that's what I discuss in my book, Your Guide to Cellular Health, is that your body requires energy. Imagine that, to turn around any disease. And when you shine that LED, that photobiomodulation light, that at the 810 to 1050 range where it actually penetrates, you are hitting one of the cytochromes, not cytochromes, the complexes, complex 4 specifically, cytochrome C oxidase, that actually uses that energy to radically increase the ATP production. So it literally is like putting energy right into your thyroid so it can do the things it needs to: reduce inflammation, decrease oxidative stress by increasing the antioxidants. So and any other detox or metabolic process is required, and almost all these processes require fundamental energy. So I think it's something to consider. It's really powerful.
I think the high-level message you're bringing with this is that thyroid function is something that is not static. If you've had a problem with it, it doesn't mean you're stuck with it. If you do things that help your body in general ways, that can be useful as well. So there's specific strategies and there's general strategies that are good, but this is something that can be healed by safe, natural methods for most people.
Yeah, and you could do that with the sun too. The issue is that virtually none of us are out there enough in the sun. Ashley's probably one of the few people, because when she's farming, she's out there a big portion of the day. But even then, you can get it indirectly, but it's such a low dose, relatively speaking, with respect to the joules of energy that get in there, that you need to be exposed for a good part of the day regularly for that to work. But if you're not, that's one of these devices you can put high amounts of energy over a short period of time, 5-10 minutes, a few times a day, and it's massively useful. I'm actually going to come out with a device to do that, like a little, maybe 2x2 inch, put over the thyroid gland. I'm inspired by you, and just use a little band around, so it makes it easy and is even cosmetically acceptable.
That's awesome.
You don't have to put these. Yeah. So I'm just so enamored with this concept of using light to help accelerate improving your biology.
I have one more bigger picture question. I don't know.
No bigger picture questions allowed here,
so,
young lady.
One thing that I learned extensively from Dr. Ray Peat is that metabolic health, cellular energy is not just the thyroid gland. There's 4 different steps after the thyroid produces thyroid hormone. So T4 is produced, then there's transporter proteins that have to take those thyroid hormones throughout the body. That T4 must be converted to T3. Cells must be able to accept that T3 and utilize it as the spark plug for energy production. So there are a number of things that can get in the way of cellular utilization of active thyroid hormone. Even if your thyroid is functioning well, using the active thyroid hormone at various other parts of your body can be hindered. And that's kind of one of the bigger reasons why in the bioenergetic space, some people promote the use of thyroid supplementation to help increase the amount of T3 active thyroid hormone available. But I wanted to, so now I understand that potentially, there are complications to relying on that in the long run. But what has been your experience with assessing cellular energy production from thyroid and how those can be disconnected? Even if your thyroid is functioning well, maybe there are blocks throughout the body. And some of the blocks that the bioenergetics space talks about is like high omega-6 consumption, PUFA consumption, lots of stress in your body, in your life, and low sunlight. Because as you mentioned, Dr. Mercola, like sunlight is required for utilizing active thyroid hormone and allowing the cells cytochrome C oxidase and all these other steps along the electron transport chain. What has been your experience with addressing those parts of the thyroid system? Because that's a very holistic view of, okay, the thyroid gland produces the hormones, but now the cells all over the body have to use the active thyroid hormone. There are a number of steps in between that.
Yeah, great question. Lots of things lots of thoughts there. So one quick one is that I always like to think about mechanistic concepts, things we know about from how biology works, cell studies, especially animal studies, human clinical outcomes, what we see empirically from larger outcome studies of humans given different medications, for example. And then also one big concept with thyroid hormone metabolism is that many have an idea like there's a bucket that has T3 and T4, and that's what the body is. And in truth, all the different tissues of the body have different thyroid hormone ecosystems. So we call these thyronomines, and there's about 12.5 of known biologically active thyronomines, the thyroid active proteins. T4 is an active hormone in many contexts. Actually, reverse T3 is an active hormone in many contexts. So yeah, there's all these different ecosystems within the brain, the liver, the heart, the muscles, the adipose tissue, and they all have their own distinct balance of thyronomines. So there really isn't a right or wrong answer across the board. But yes, there's countless ways in which any way your health is not right, it changes your balance of thyronomines. And the question is, does that cause a failure or does that cause a compensation? And it's hard to distinguish those things. Empirically, humans given T4 only versus humans given combination therapies, we've got a fair amount of data. And the data is pretty clear that humans who do benefit and need thyroid medications, combination therapies that are more than just T4 are viable options in many cases. Some exceptions like pregnancy and a few others, but in most cases, they're very viable options. And there's many people that do much better. One big study had people not knowingly take either T4 only or combination therapy in the form of natural desiccated thyroid. And it was a double crossover study. So they were taking different ones, not knowing which they were on when. And pretty much no one said, hey, I feel better on the blue pill when the blue pill was T4 only. But about 84% felt better on the combination therapy, not knowing that it was. And there's good evidence that when it's done for appropriate participants, that the side effects are not greater and not worsened. So yeah, it's totally valid. It's something that I do endorse in many contexts. But yeah, T4 is an active hormone. The body does require that. Reverse T3 is an active hormone. Many others are as well. And they're used differently in all these different little thyroid ecosystems of the body.
Because I just find it so fascinating that the body's always listening. The body is always sensing what's coming in, and it's always sensing the amount that's coming in. And so when someone's on a low calorie diet or a low carb diet, like the body senses that. And I've helped people through and seen, okay, when they're in that state for periods of time, their reverse T3 increases. So then reverse T3 will then reduce the amount that cells can actually utilize T3 at the cellular level. That's a protective mechanism because the body senses we can't push the pedal down on the car to go faster because there's not enough fuel coming in. So the body's able to adjust these things in real time. Curious, what's the role that iodine may play in cellular utilization? So are there other areas in the body that can store iodine like the thyroid can?
Well, so there's a couple areas that do, and sometimes the reasons are because they use them. Other times it's because of just embryologic overlap with the production of those tissues and production of thyroid tissue. The cases where it is used would be breast tissue. So that's a case where iodine is modulated. And That's a fascinating topic we could go pretty deep into.
Wait, your breast tissue stores iodine
It can.
in like higher quantity?
So the
Wow.
mechanism is the sodium iodide symporter, and that's the same one that pulls iodine into the thyroid. And there's different degrees of expression of the sodium iodide symporter in breast tissue. So healthy, non-lactating breast tissue, it's not particularly active. Pathologic breast tissue, let me back up, lactating breast tissue. Now, the reason for this is in the case of the thyroid and the breast tissue, the amount of iodine in the bloodstream may not be appropriate for the thyroid or for the nursing baby. So this is both a pump, but also a gatekeeper. This can pull in cases of a lack or block in cases of excess. So mom can get reasonable amounts in the breast milk. Now, there's pathologic changes that can occur both in fibroadenomatous disease, used to be called fibrocystic breast disease, and in many types of hormonally sensitive breast cancers. And in those cases, the sodium iodide symporter is overexpressed. So there's a heightened uptake of iodine and then corresponding damage to the cells because of that.
Is this anything to do with the reason why David Bronstein and Guy Abraham had recommended iodine to treat fibrocystic breast disease and other
that's kind of what got the whole ball rolling with stuff. Guy Abraham, dear man, passed away. I spent a lot of time conversing with him, went through all of his literature and all of the citations. So he was a gynecologist, and he saw some papers showing that doses of iodine that were above physiologically normal could lower the symptoms of fibrocystic breast disease for about 2/3 of women for about a couple months. And he didn't differentiate how a nutrient could be a nutrient and or it could be a drug. You know, niacin can lower cholesterol, not saying that all high cholesterol is a niacin deficiency. So what happened is that in fibrocystic breast disease, that sodium iodide symporter is overexpressed, too much is brought in, and that can create some damage to the cells, which can cause swelling and pain and fluid buildup. Now, just like in the thyroid, high dose iodine can temporarily stop the uptake. So it doesn't work for everyone, and it doesn't work for long periods of time. But for short periods of time, you can lower the iodine uptake by high dose supplementation. Now, they also started to theorize that the truth was that Japanese women generally had lower rates of breast cancer on traditional diets, and they had a higher intake of iodine. And so they speculated a more broad way in which iodine had some palliative or protective effect for breast tissue. And we now know that the fibroadenomatous case wasn't protective, it was just shutting off the symporter. In the case of breast cancers, there have been assays looking at Japanese women and contrasting their iodine excretion, their urinary iodine in groups, with their overall breast cancer risk. And those in the highest quintiles and quartiles have proportionally higher risks for breast cancer, and there's a linear relationship. So the more they're consuming, the greater their risks are. So currently, researchers think that the way in which the traditional Japanese had lower rates of breast cancer was probably from many, many factors. And if anything, the iodine was not a protective factor, it was probably the opposite. And that's borne out from population studies in other areas of the world as well.
Wow, fascinating.
Yes, really. Thank you for elaborating that. I was curious how they got diverted, because that focus on many clinicians on using iodine therapeutically creates this massive confusion in people interested in natural medicine, as Ashley shared earlier today when she was in the store earlier this week. And there's massive confusion, and they're hurting themselves, and then no one, the clinicians prescribing it or the patients receiving it, that's the furthest thing from their mind, and there's no ulterior motive like there are in so many areas. There's no benefit. They're trying to do the best they can, and it's mistaken information. And that's why I'm so passionate about spreading your message far and wide, because it's so simple. Well, it's simple. It's not easy, but it's simple, because it does require some effort to find these low iodine foods is not easy.
Well, and I would argue that if you look at a lot of the extreme diets that many pursue for thyroid health, it's easier than those.
This is easier.
You're not cutting out foods as dramatically.
It's not forever.
It's not forever, and it's not as extreme.
Yeah, I agree. So I can't tell you how much I appreciate your efforts to do this and resolve my massive confusion in this area. I mean, it's just been thoroughly confused in my entire clinical career. I never, because I got down the rabbit hole of the iodine was required to improve thyroid function. And interestingly, during COVID, I popularized the therapy of nebulized hydrogen peroxide and saline, which are the foundations of it. And there was this David Brownstein had incorporated, it suggested, strongly encouraged people to use iodine as a disinfectant in there. Somehow, intrinsically, my gut feeling said, no, I'm not going to, I never recommended iodine. I feel really glad about that. And we did wind up selling a thyroid supplement for a while, but it was like a milligram, 1,000 micrograms. It wasn't high like 10, 12, 20 milligrams that Brownstein's recommended.
Peroxide's a cool thing. You get that oxygen to break something down, and then you get water. So it's much, much less toxic.
Oh, and it's a doses, but it could be toxic at a higher dose, but we're talking a dose of 0.1%, which is 30 times lower than you get in the peroxide you find in the drugstore. So it's a signaling molecule at that point, but it's also antivirucidal. So it's a powerful tool, and especially this time of year. I tell all my friends and relatives that the moment, that absolute first sign and signal, you just do that literally, and then do a few more times a day. That's it. End of story. You have no more problems with that. Ashley had that. What was your results? She's one of them. Earlier this week, was it last week? What happened with it? You were doing that?
I got sick just one night. Whenever I travel, I live on a farm, so I'm pretty disconnected from like, I don't go to airports much. I don't go to big cities much. And so that's just like a big change in my exposure. So I need to carry around a nebulizer in my purse.
She realizes it now. So explain that to her. But I think we talked, you had only had the symptoms for 6 hours. You had really, a really new infection. Tell us what happened when you did the nebulization.
Nebulized right away, and I'm totally fine now. So
how long did it take? How long did it take?
2 or 3 nebulizer treatments.
Yeah, one day.
Yeah.
One day.
Oh, yeah.
You did not have you woke up with the symptoms that were so bad.
Yeah.
You couldn't breathe through your mouth.
I woke up mouth breathing because my nose was so.
Oh, yeah, you couldn't breathe through your nose. I'm sorry.
Nebulized with hydrogen peroxide and saline solution.
Saline.
Boom, done.
Yeah, by that night you were fine. End of disease.
Which again shows hydrogen peroxide is totally fine as like an antimicrobial option. Yet for some reason, everything is now relying on iodine instead.
Yes, indeed. It's crazy. Crazy indeed. Well, did you have any more questions, Ashley? Any more curiosity?
I just have a wrap-up takeaway point, because I like to leave the audience with empowering and encouraging words.
Why would you want to do that?
Because there's so much fear-mongering in the space. I think one of the coolest things is that go check out the work of Dr. Christianson, and you'll see the results of people who have elevated thyroid antibodies, which many people get these days. And then their doctor's like, it's an autoimmune condition you got to deal with the rest of your life. And like, his work doesn't show that. And there are practical take-home points where you can reverse that. And so I think understanding these things should empower you to never identify as, I am broken, I have this condition.
Amen.
Here are practical steps where you may need to be restrictive in the short term with opening up possibilities of what you can consume after the fact once you kind of reach a new baseline. I just think that that's so powerful, and
it is.
You shouldn't feel like you're stuck with a diagnosis for the rest of your life.
Great. Well, on that note, I want to thank both of you for joining us, and Ashley for expanding the conversation, and Dr. Christianson for all your pioneering work that we will be very soon widely promoting, because the world needs to know about this information. It's something they need to know to dispel the myths around this. So thanks again. And people, your book is The Thyroid Reset Diet. And I think, why don't you share your resources again, your website and your social media?
Yeah, drchristianson.com. And wrong ways to spell it, still get there. Yeah, drchristianson.com.
That's nice.
And then is the green list, yellow list, and red list on that website?
It is.
Foods. Yeah, the foods. All right. Well, thanks a lot. And we'll keep up the good work, and we'll take it from there. Thanks so much for watching. Remember, hit the like and subscribe button so you can get more videos that can help you and your family take control of your health.